All right, everyone, welcome back to the Energeia podcast. This is Dr. G, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Roderick MacDonald. Rod is a colleague of mine at the International School of Business at the University of Economics, Ho Chi Minh City, where he teaches international business. He has published extensively on the subject of commerce and trade in the Southeast Asia region, and is the author of several books, including The Economy and Business Environment of Vietnam, Southeast Asia and the ASEAN Economic Community, and Eurocritical, as well as his most recent book, Open and Closed Economies, Lessons from the Philippines and Vietnam, which is still very warm off the press and the central topic of which will form the focus of our discussion today. Rod has also published articles in multiple academic journal outlets, including the Journal of Global Business Administration and the Global Journal of Strategies and Governance. And prior to joining the faculty here at ISB here in Vietnam, Rod logged many hours lecturing in the School of Management at UQAM, L'Université du Québec à Montréal, in beautiful Montreal, Quebec, Canada, where I was fortunate enough to live myself for a time. He has spent about half of the last decade in Southeast Asia and has lived here in Vietnam since January 2020. Rod, salut, bienvenue, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here with me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
All right, Rod. So today you're going to take us all on a comparative tour between the economies of two countries, Vietnam, which as I mentioned, you and I have both called home for the last few years, and the Philippines, which you've also done a lot of work on, and you've done a lot of scholarly investigation on, and these are both massively populated countries with some 100 million odd people apiece. Both the countries that have had long and often turbulent histories with the presence of foreign governments, if not direct foreign rulers, which have undoubtedly shaped their resulting economic trajectories. But and both are also newly industrialized economies and generally considered to be lower middle income economies. I think I have that right. The Philippines is currently the 32nd largest economy in the world as measured by GDP, and Vietnam is 37th. And prior to COVID completely turning the world on its head, both of these nations were among the 5 fastest growing in the world. And apparently during the first year of the pandemic, Vietnam was the highest growth economy in the world. Again, or so I understand it as a layperson. So my first question, what does it mean in layperson's terms to say that nations like the Philippines and Vietnam are growing fast, and what are the implications of that rapid growth?
Well, there's a lot more in that question than appears at first, because, well, the easy answer is to say whose GDP is increasing more quickly. Then you have to realize that there can be other factors. For example, if we look at Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, not Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, in the 1990s and 2000s, let's say the build-up to the global financial crisis, the Republic of Ireland has an astronomical growth in GDP. But if you look at another measure of the size of the economy, gross national income, it also has remarkable growth, but not as spectacular as GDP. And the reason is that much of the Republic of Ireland's growth is due to foreign investment. So much of or I shouldn't say much, a portion of the profits accruing to that growth were leaving the country. So not all of the income was staying within Ireland. And that's sort of a half-baked, simple explanation of why the gross national income was not increasing as fast as gross domestic product. So nonetheless, the best way to do it is to look at GDP and the rate of GDP growth. But again, there's a little complication, because if we look at two countries and both countries grow, their GDP grows at the same rate as the other country, right? Both of them grow at the same rate, but one country doubles its population in that time, well, yes, the economy is growing more quickly, but it doesn't quite make sense to say the economy or the people or the country is becoming more wealthy. What's happening is there's more population, but each individual person is not really generating more wealth. Right? So in the end, what we mean, well, it depends on what we mean, our will to mean something, right? But in the end, what we're looking for is some measure of how much the people in the country produce. And now we may think it's how much people in the country own or how much income they have, but that's getting us into another question of distribution of wealth, which is important, but is not the issue we're looking for. So we're looking for a measure of how much people produce. So we look at GDP, and we also look at GDP per capita. Now, the reason we look at these two countries, Vietnam and the Philippines, is that they are, first of all, they're fairly similar in size. Vietnam is a little less than 100 million, and the Philippines is a little more than 100 million. I think it's 107 million and as opposed to 97 million, but I haven't counted in the past week. So they're fairly similar in size, and they're more or less in the same category. In GDP per capita, the Philippines is clearly wealthier than Vietnam. But they're more or less similar, and they're in the same area of the world. So it makes sense to look at these two. But there are differences that are important, right? On the one hand, Vietnam is basically a long, skinny country, right? S-shaped, but a long, skinny S. And the Philippines is an archipelago. It's like a bunch of islands. And even if we only look at the large islands, we still have around 10 islands. So what that means is, on the one hand, it makes it more difficult to run the economy because there's all these shipping challenges. And on the other, it could be a false increase in the economy because you have all these added costs in, and that raises the GDP. So once you start looking at the economy, the question can become a little bit complicated. Nonetheless, we can put aside many of these issues and just say, okay, Vietnam and the Philippines are two countries which are similar. We can compare them and then ask questions based on that comparison. So the question I had in mind is whether the openness of an economy is beneficial to that economy. In other words, does it lead to greater prosperity? And that seemed like a fairly clear-cut, simple question to me at first. But then you end up running into complications. Well, first of all, we can ask, okay, what do we mean by an open economy? And that's fairly straightforward. There are three elements to an open economy. One
Actually, sorry, Rod, before you jump in there, maybe I can just quickly, just to set you up, because I think this ties into the next thing I was going to ask, just to help us bring this back to more of a lay audience. I mean, most non-experts would probably assume, just based on general outsiders' impressions, like perhaps even cosmetic, superficial impressions, that Vietnam is a communist country with, at the very least, a nominally socialist economy, and that the Philippines is a democratic country with, at the very least, a nominally capitalist economy. And I realize it's more complex and more complicated than that. But I just wonder, just as you start to talk about the difference between an open and closed economy and what constitutes an open and closed economy, I wonder if, despite How much influence is there of these ostensible differences in structure and in ideology, which influence whether these economies end up being open or closed in the end?
So what we would expect, or perhaps I would say what we would have expected 20 years ago, ideas are changing now, but basically what we would expect is that the Philippines is a democracy and it's capitalist, and therefore we'd expect free markets and an open economy, whereas Vietnam is communist, is socialist, it's a command economy, the government runs the economy, and we'd expect a closed economy. But the opposite is true. In other words, we expect one thing, but in reality, we see something else completely different. And I think we won't have time to develop it, but basically what's happening here is the people running the government in the Philippines and the people running in the government in Vietnam are more important than the theory. So in the Philippines, what we have is for historical reasons, is a relatively small number of very influential families, depending how you count them, between 5 and 20 families, that more or less control the government. So even though in theory it's a democracy, it's very much like the democracy of my country in Canada in the 19th century, where at least in the countryside, you bought votes, you paved roads according to who voted for you and that sort of thing. And that is still very strong in the Philippines. So there are a large number of people who vote, who basically ask advice on who they should vote for, and they're told, well, vote for this guy, and they vote for that guy, and then often they get paid money for it, right? So as a result, the government, the economy of the Philippines is commanded, right, by a group of people who are serving their own interests. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody in the Philippine government is a bad guy. And it doesn't mean that everybody in the Philippine government is an egoist and selfish. I'm just painting with a very simple brush, right? Philippines is a wonderful country and wonderful people, but there is a flaw. To me, there's a clear flaw in the way politics works there. And as a consequence, the economy is a closed economy, right? Whereas in Vietnam, again, wonderful people, but like the Philippines, imperfect people, right? In government and out of government, right? But by and large, we still have a strong sense of patriotism, of the importance of the whole country, right? And so the tendency is, with corruption and all that, the tendency is to try to make a more wealthy economy. And so the policies we find in Vietnam and the policies we find in the Philippines are starkly different, right? So the Philippines has a closed economy and Vietnam has an open economy. We can nuance that. But basically, the Philippines has been trying to limit international trade, trying to limit imports, and they have a good reason for that, a good historical reason. And they're also trying to limit foreign direct investment in their country. So for example, Toyota Philippines does not belong to Toyota Japan. It belongs to a Philippine corporation. It belongs to a Filipino. At least 60%. I don't remember the exact percentage. So they're in that sort of situation. Why would I invest tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in a country if I can't control the way that country, that business will be managed, right? So that discourages foreign direct investment, when there's a limit on ownership. We look at Vietnam, and there has been strong encouragement of foreign direct investment. There has been strong, okay, it's a bit more complicated here. There's been strong encouragement of exports, but you can't do that without allowing imports, right? Because your partners will expect a correspondence, right? So it's contrary to what we'd expect. We'd expect the Philippines to be the open government and Vietnam to be the closed government. But it's the contrary, right? The open economy is Vietnam's and the closed economy is the Philippines. Now, why are the Philippines like that and why is Vietnam like that? Would you like me to develop that?
Yeah, I'd just be interested to know, just like both in terms of recent history, and maybe perhaps we could start with the slightly more long-term, ultimate distal history. But how did it get to be that way? How did it get to be the way that the perception, or at least the lay perception, of openness versus closedness in these two countries is in such stark contrast to the reality on the ground? How did that those two initial economic trajectories get set in motion, and how did they get perpetuated and continued thereafter?
Okay, so we'll start with the Philippines because we go back further in history. So the Philippines, as you mentioned earlier, were a Spanish colony and an American administrative territory, which more or less a colony. And then during the Second World War, were occupied by Japan, and then was liberated by being bombed, very heavily bombed, and basically left in shambles after the Second World War. So, as you know, the Americans were fairly generous after the Second World War in helping economies rebuild. Not only their allies, but also the countries on the other side, Japan and Germany. And they also offered aid to the Philippines. However, that aid was contingent on a few things. And also, shortly after the war, the U.S., I forget the actual political wrangling, but basically the Philippines became an independent country. Originally on the 4th of July, the American Independence Day, later changed by the Filipinos, but part of the conditions was that the Philippines would get that money if there was a free trade agreement with the United States, one, and two, there would be an exchange rate fixed, which was the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Philippine peso before the Second World War. Now, that seemed reasonable, except what happened during the Second World War? Well, the Americans were very important in the Second World War, but also their economic machine grew during the war, right? It went into war footing. They went away from producing cars to producing tanks, whatever, right? And the economy grew. Whereas in the Philippines, the economy was ransacked, first by the Japanese and then by the liberation. And so the Philippine economy, which was not all that great before Second World War, was weaker still. So the true exchange rate could no longer be that of pre-World War II. So what this meant was that Philippine businesses doing free trade with the US were at a disadvantage. And they just got washed. They got totally laundered in the free trade, right? And that left a bad taste in the mouth of Filipinos, particularly those wealthy families. So there remains a philosophy of openness. We don't want foreigners owning businesses in the Philippines. We don't want imports coming from other countries because it ends up hurting our economy. So I call that like the original sin, right, of the Filipino economy. It's left traces, left ways of thinking, and that continue. Now, just a few months ago, things changed a little bit in the Philippines, but we may not cover that. Okay, that's the Philippines. That's why there has been policies, for example, regarding foreign direct investment, that when foreigners invest in a company in the Philippines, they can only own up to 40% of the company, of the business. This was true right up until February 2022, so 2 months ago. Secondly, the Philippines has a lot of tariff barriers, not within ASEAN. ASEAN may replace it with non-tariff measures, which are diminishing. But for much of the 20th century, at least, there have been tariff barriers, and even in this century, worldwide. Now, so that's more or less how that started in the Philippines. If we move over to Vietnam, so Vietnam started the 20th century as a French colony, and then Vietnamese had a war with the French, which then mutated into a war with the Americans. This ended in, I think, 1975, right? But the Americans, I don't know if it's because the Vietnamese were very rough and aggressive in negotiating the peace terms. This may be before your time, may not be, but they spent months deciding on the shape of the table for the negotiations.
I heard about this. I heard they were very, very particular about very, very what seemed to be trivial details. Yeah. Not so trivial in the end.
Yes. But of course, your field, you realize this sort of thing can be important. I remember going to one business school, and a colleague asked me to contact a business to do a case, and it turned out the business was a big contributor to that business school. So I got a call from the dean of the school, and I got called into his office. And the way his office was set up, he had like a secretarial area, and then he had his office was like a walled fortress, and there was a hallway going into it and a door, and there was a door into the hallway. So the secretary says, "Go ahead." And then I go into this doorway, into this hallway, and the door's closed. I'm stuck between one door and then the door to his office, and then I had to wait there 10 minutes while he's talking on the phone. And then I finally go into his office, and then his chair is like way up, and my chair is way down, and I was supposed to be imitated by that. I just thought, well, what a jerk. But that was what was going on with that negotiation, I think. We read it as the Vietnamese being very particular. It may be that the Americans were trying to dominate them with the table. I don't know. Okay, so after that, because of that bad taste, perhaps, or for whatever reasons, the Americans ended the war, but they put Vietnam under embargo. And when the U.S. do that, it's not just United States goods, right? They influence their allies to join in the embargo. So Vietnam did not taste international trade until 1994. So the whole 20th century, right, they were deprived of that. And so by the time 1994 came around, they had their opportunity to experiment with all these communist and socialist approaches, the command economy, communal farms and all this. And just like China had done, they just found it didn't work, and they were ready to run with it, right? Already in the mid-1980s, they started to change their policies. So by the time 1994 came around, they were ready to run, and they were open, right? So that's how those two economies came to be different, the way they're different. Now I want to talk about 2 or 3 things here. We want to see what the results were. We want to see also what exactly we mean by open. There's a little detail there. and there's a third thing, which escapes me right now. I just want to talk about when we say open, for example, in trade, we can mean two different things. Because reality sometimes is more complicated than our ideas. So we can look at an economy and see, is it, the academics have a complicated expression for this. They use Latin, right? They say de jure. So the policy of the country is to be open to trade. But then you have to look at what really happens. Is there more international trade? So there's two different approaches to this. One is to look at the policies of the country. Is this country open or not? And the other way to do it is to look at the statistics. Is there more international trade or not? So typically, what you do in the second case is you compare the imports plus the exports, the total being your international trade, compared to your GDP, and you get that ratio. So that way you're able to compare big countries with little countries and see how open they are, right? In terms of how much international trade they do. It's complicated again, because if we look at a country that's surrounded by other countries, and they're small, well then they're much more likely to engage in international trade than if we have a very large country bordered on two small economies. So if we look at the United States, it's a huge economy. So they have a lot going on inside the country. And in fact, they do have less international trade as a portion of their GDP. Whereas if we look at smaller economies, I guess the tendency would be to look at Europe. You have the European Union there. So if we look at smaller countries like Singapore, it's easier. It's not that it's easier. They're sort of forced to do international trade because there's so little going on inside their economy, even though they're a very wealthy country. Okay, so what actually happened? First of all, before we look at Vietnam and the Philippines, what happens worldwide if we look at open economies and closed economies? Right? Because a lot of research has been done, a lot of empirical research looking at countries, actually usually it's done looking at foreign direct investment, the relationship to prosperity, and then looking at openness to trade and its relationship to prosperity. Now, 250 years ago, Adam Smith said, well, international trade is good for prosperity because, look, it's common sense. We're very good at making coffee. You're very good at producing milk. So we trade and we both have flat whites, right? We both have lattes, right? And we're happier that way. And that's basically an extension of his explanation of the origin of business, right? He talks about how trade began before, with prehistoric man, although I don't think he was that old. But so, yes, international trade makes sense, right? And then about 50 years later, David Ricardo says, not only is that true, but there's even more reason to be interested in international trade. He said, if you have one economy which is better than everybody else at everything, and it's surrounded by other economies that are, good at stuff, but not as good as this first economy, it still makes sense for that economy to concentrate on what it does best and trade for everything else, because it's going to create more value in that one thing it does best. So he strengthened the argument that international trade is good. However, Hamilton in the United States, Alexander Hamilton, I think he became president at one point, right? He said, yeah, that's a nice theory, but the trouble is we have to do trade in the real world, and other countries are not open to trade. And so they'll take advantage of our openness. So what he was pointing out is the theory is one thing, but you have to run the economy in the real world, and there can be issues. Right? Okay. We move forward into the 20th century and into the 21st century, and there have been many, many economists who have done empiric research. Is openness good for prosperity or not? And their resounding conclusion is maybe, maybe not. In other words...
Very, very resounding conclusion there.
Yes. Some of them are very clear that yes, for example, foreign direct investment is good for prosperity, but others strongly say no, it's not good for prosperity. The same for international trade. It's good or it's not good. And when you think about it, it's so obvious. What is colonialism from the economic viewpoint? From the political science viewpoint, that's another issue. I don't know much about that. But from the economic viewpoint, it's basically foreign direct investment. But almost all the benefits go to the empire and not to the colony. Not quite true. I mean, Vietnam still uses, to a great extent, the railways built by the French, right? There are benefits. Medicine, I mean, Africa, right, benefited a lot from medicine. I think that France probably exploited Africa very aggressively, right? But the medicine from France did benefit a lot, right? But by and large, the colony system is foreign direct investment, but it's not a good deal.
And just maybe just to sort of reorient us back towards the sort of focal countries here. So just talking about this kind of new economic, well, it's not new, but this economic conception of colonization and like how the benefits accrue to the quote colonizer. I'm just sort of wondering about these specific cases of Vietnam and the Philippines. What can these teach us about those aspects of global commerce in a broader sense? You've mentioned foreign direct investment already, but I mean, like, is there anything else about the comparative analysis between Vietnam and the Philippines, being analyzed in concert? Does that illuminate anything else with respect to like quote unquote open international trade and capital movement, and whether these can facilitate genuine prosperity? Like, what does the empirical research show us about how much of an illustrative case the examples of Vietnam and the Philippines are?
Very good. So, the general research in all the countries doesn't give clear-cut conclusions, right? And there are reasons for that. If we look at the specific cases of Vietnam and the Philippines, and there's details there, but I'll skip that. Basically, Vietnam shows greater growth and prosperity than the Philippines. Right. This is very true if we look at one period of the Philippines economy, basically from about 1960, when we first get reliable statistics, until the end of the century, or until 1994. We take 35 years there. The Philippines was basically stagnant. I mean, it grew a bit, but not much compared. And this is a period of time where worldwide economies were going quickly, very quickly. Except Vietnam, because Vietnam was at war, right? It was at war, and then under embargo. So we can't compare those years. But we can compare it to Vietnam once it was freed from the embargo. And there, Vietnam's a clear winner. Right?
So just to resituate ourselves there. So it's from about 1994 was the year that Vietnam's, I'm presuming, trade relations with the US were renormalized at that point, or normalized anew at that point. Vietnam just generally opened up, embargoes were lifted. Do I have that right? 1994 was kind of the year where things shifted dramatically. The whole economic paradigm kind of shifted in Vietnam. Do I have that right? And what was the kind of trajectory that followed from that touchstone event taking place?
Well, Vietnam's growth exploded. It skyrocketed. Let's see, I'm not sure. Can I share a graph with you? Basically, from 1994 to, let's say, the global financial, just before the global financial crisis, Vietnam's GDP per capita was varied between 4 and 8%, and most of the time was above 6%. Whereas if we look at the Philippines during those same years, so giving the Philippines the advantage rather than comparing them with the 20th century, the Philippines varied between, well, negative growth, right, to as high as about 4%. So Vietnam outperformed the Philippines in this period, basically the 25 years previous to the pandemic. You follow? So Vietnam outperformed the Philippines. But if we, maybe it's less scientific, but if we look at when the Philippines were even more closed, from 1960 to 1994, and when the whole world was growing so quickly, or the whole world, most of the world was growing so quickly, the Philippines were even worse, right? They were really stagnant. So this tells us, these two cases tell us that opening up can be advantageous, and being closed probably is going to be a disadvantage. Now, why do I say it can be advantageous? Well, because if you're opened up, but you're basically a colony of another country, the benefits don't accrue to you, or very few of the benefits will accrue to you, right? So it also depends upon the cleverness of the government in managing foreign direct investment and in managing foreign trade. So if we look at the case of foreign direct investment, it all has to do with the deal. You see, in order to attract foreign direct investment, foreign businesses have to benefit, right? They're not going to invest in your country if they can't make money. So they want to make a profit in your country. And that may be because for the same sales figure, they can reduce their costs, because raw materials transported to the factory are cheaper in that country, because energy costs are lower, maybe your electricity is cheaper, or your oil is a bit cheaper than the world market, right? Or wage costs are lower, or perhaps because your people work better with their hands, right? It could be all sorts of things. There could be interest in that. But then the government has to make rules about taxes, about salaries, right? So about suppliers, whether you use local suppliers or so on. So if basically, if we have, let's say, a country where this wouldn't happen, Monaco, right? We have foreign direct investment in Monaco, and the business investing in Monaco builds a big factory there, and then all of the employees in the factory come from the other country. They don't pay taxes to Monaco, and all the profits go to the other country. Well, Monaco is not benefiting from it. So if you're going to allow foreign direct investment in your country, you do have to make it attractive. So there have to be benefits in investing in your country. But at the same time, the deal has to be beneficial to you. You have to get something. So the local government should have a plan in terms of developing local supplier industries, in terms of somewhat higher wages for those employees, in terms of some tax staying in the country. Right? So it's the deal. In terms of international trade, the deal is slightly different. It's often reciprocity in trade, and there it can become very complicated. For example, tariffs is an old-fashioned kind of trade barrier, and they may make a return. But usually countries do have another way of putting a barrier to trade. And it's a reasonable barrier. So a government is supposed to protect its citizens, right? So they don't want dangerous products sold in their country. I don't know the exact story, but it seems there's a cheese in Sicily that's filled with worms, right? And it's a great cheese. I've never tried it. But it cannot be imported into the States because it's deemed to be unhealthy, right? Okay, so it's up to the country to make those rules. The thing is, those same rules can be used to exclude all sorts of products. A few months ago, we had the case of China blocking dragon fruit to Thailand and Vietnam, saying that there was coronavirus traces in the dragon fruit.
Yeah, I was reading about
that. I'm not, an expert in that, although I do remember, reading in many sources that food cannot be a source of the coronavirus, COVID contagion. But I don't know. But it could be a case of China just playing rough with some economic partners, right? So yes, open economies, both in terms of foreign direct investment and trade, can be very beneficial. But both of those have to be managed well by the government.
Right, and I think that this actually sets up I think an interesting final question that I want to ask you. I mean, because this may be just a case of semantics, but just as a final question to you, Rod, I just want to sort of like touch on the notions of openness and freeness or freedom in trade. So I mean, what do these two cases tell us about what people call just almost colloquially a free market, and perhaps even more broadly, what is a free market? Does this comparison between Vietnam and the Philippines demonstrate anything significant about free markets altogether? So, I mean, I know you've just been commenting on, the system's got to be set up right and everything's got to be structured properly and everything like that. But do the examples themselves tell us anything about whether there's actually a more than semantic difference between freedom of trade and freedom of movement of goods and people and things like that, and what you've been referring to as an open or closed economy? Okay,
so basically two things. Although the second thing, I may be reading it into these cases because I'd already arrived at that for other reasons, right? So the first thing is that one thing is theory and the other is practice. So in theory, we would expect Vietnam to be a closed economy, and in theory, we would expect the Philippines to be an open economy. But in practice, it's the opposite. So we have to look at the statistics, we have to look at the laws and regulations of the country, and not at the form of government to decide whether the economy is open. Right? So the second issue, second learning point is openness and freedom. So an open economy is a greater freedom of market. That means that my business in Vietnam can do business with clients or suppliers in Cambodia or in Germany, right? So I have greater freedom of action. Whereas in the Philippines, I cannot do business with suppliers in another country that easily. right? There's all sorts of complications. And sometimes the complications are, no, you cannot, right? It's a clear policy. And sometimes the complications are just bureaucratic procedures that slow down the whole thing and stifle the business. But this business of free market is really, you see, we may think that a free market is absence of rules. But then what happens is you get bullies. You get individual businesses that dominate. Now, large, powerful businesses in themselves are not bad. Among other things, we do want to benefit from our economies of scale. It's not only the business that benefits, everyone can benefit because things are much cheaper. We wouldn't have microprocessors today, as advanced as they are, if there were hundreds and hundreds of businesses making microprocessors, right? It just, the population of the planet is not big enough to support so many microprocessor businesses and have them be efficient producers. But nonetheless, if we have a totally free from rules economy, that will not be a free economy. Because the economy will be dominated by businesses with, whether it's predatory pricing or totally dominating advertising or superior distribution channels will dominate businesses. And so to have a free market, we need to have some sort of either industry associations, but I think that doesn't work that well, or government interventions, and that doesn't always work that well either, right? But we need some moderation of the economy for the market to be free. So our first notion of a free economy, our first naive notion is faulty. If there are no rules, the economy will end up being unfree. We need some sort of rules. That's before we take into consideration a lot of other issues that are also important, right? We want scams on the phone or on the internet or in person. We want those to be illegal. We want it to be illegal to sell toys that are poisonous. Children pick up a toy and start gnawing on it. We don't want that toy to be toxic. So, but even before that, we need rules to keep the market free. And I would say that Vietnam is perhaps doing a bit better there, but both countries have a way to go.
Well, this is great. I mean, I think we can probably wrap it up there. But I think that the great thing about this conversation is kind of just being captured by that last thing you've just said. That everything you've said today, I think, has been such an important contribution of nuance and shades of gray to really, fill out and kind of augment people's understanding. Because I think for the average layperson, there's a conceptual split down the middle between, socialism and a closed economy on the one hand, and then a nominally capitalist and open economy on the other hand. And, I think what you've been able to illuminate for us today is that it's often far more complex than how it appears on the surface. And I think that the Vietnam and Philippines comparison has helped shed some important light in that respect. So I really appreciate the time you've made for us today, Professor MacDonald. It's been great to hear from you and to hear some stuff you've been thinking about and working on and your perspectives in this area, because I think it really is it's going to pump some people's intuitions in a very counterintuitive way with respect to what actual economic openness and economic freedom is. So I really appreciate you making so much time for me today, and maybe we can do this again another time soon.
Well, that'd be great. My pleasure.
All right, take care, mate. Thank you.
putative.